Judge Alan Prescott prided himself on maintaining absolute control over his courtroom. He had built a reputation as a no-nonsense, by-the-book judge who tolerated no distractions, no deviations, and certainly no challenges to his authority. To those who entered his domain, his word was law. And yet, on this particular morning, he had no idea he was about to meet an adversary who would shake the very foundation of his carefully curated order. Pam Bondi strode through the grand doors of the Tampa courthouse, her heels clicking with steady confidence against the polished floors. The morning air outside had been crisp, but inside, the atmosphere was thick with the weight of justice, or in some cases injustice. She had been here more times than she could count, and to her, this was just another routine hearing. A business dispute, simple in nature, requiring no more than her standard sharp wit and legal expertise to resolve. But routine was a dangerous illusion. As she walked towards the defendant's table, she felt the weight of eyes on her. She had always been keenly aware of her surroundings. It was a skill honed over years of legal battles, where reading the room could be the difference between victory and defeat. And today, the air in the courtroom felt different. Stiff, heavy, like a storm just waiting to break. It wasn't until she set her briefcase down that she noticed the true source of the tension. Judge Prescott was staring at her, but not at her face. His gaze was fixed just below her collarbone. A simple gold cross, delicate yet unmistakable, rested against the fabric of her blouse. A gift from her grandmother, a quiet symbol of faith that she had worn for years without a second thought. Prescott cleared his throat, the sound slicing through the hushed courtroom like the crack of a whip. The few spectators in attendance sat up straighter, sensing something unusual was about to unfold. "Miss Bondi," Prescott's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "I must remind you that religious symbols have no place in my courtroom." A ripple of murmurs passed through the room. The court clerk hesitated, fingers hovering above her keyboard. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. It was an unusual directive, even from a judge known for his rigid approach to decorum. Pam felt the heat of the moment rising, but she remained calm, lifting a single brow as she met his gaze. "Your Honor," she said, her voice smooth as silk, "you're wearing a cross." A pin-drop silence fell over the courtroom. Prescott's face remained impassive, but his grip on the armrest of his chair tightened slightly. "That violates the neutrality of this space," he continued. "You'll need to remove it or face a fine." Pam didn't move. She didn't even blink. The weight of his words settled over her like a challenge, and she wasn't one to back down. Not when she knew she was right. "With all due respect, Your Honor, my cross is no different than a wedding ring or a locket with a family photo inside," she said, her tone measured. "Unless you intend to police every piece of personal jewelry in this courtroom, I fail to see how this is a violation." The murmurs grew louder. A legal battle was unfolding, but it wasn't the one anyone had come here to witness. Prescott exhaled sharply, already growing tired of the discussion. "That's not how I see it." He adjusted his robe, as if to physically reaffirm his authority. "Either remove it, or I'll issue a fine for disregarding courtroom neutrality." Pam felt a flicker of something deeper than frustration. It was indignation, righteous and unwavering. She had been fined before, but never for something like this. Never for a personal expression of belief that had absolutely no bearing on the case at hand. The fine wasn't the issue. It was the principle. She folded her hands over her briefcase, her expression cool and unreadable. "Your Honor, before we continue, I'd like to address this issue formally." Prescott raised a brow. "Address it?" "Yes," Pam said evenly. "I'll be filing an objection and would like to state my argument on record." The judge smirked, glancing at the clock on the wall. "Miss Bondi, I'm sure you're aware that this hearing is about a business dispute, not your personal grievances." Pam didn't flinch. She sat up straighter, her voice clear and unwavering. "I'm also aware that the First Amendment doesn't take a recess for personal opinions." That got his attention. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready. The air in the room grew thick with anticipation. Even the bailiff, who had seen countless cases unfold in this very courtroom, seemed suddenly more alert. Everyone knew what was happening now. This wasn't just a fine. This wasn't just an argument. This was a challenge. Prescott leaned back slightly, narrowing his eyes. "Miss Bondi," he said, his voice dangerously low. "I suggest you tread carefully." Pam didn't hesitate. "You're fining me for wearing a cross. Let's break that down legally, shall we?" She reached into her briefcase, her movements deliberate, controlled. The tension in the courtroom stretched taut as she pulled out a single sheet of paper and placed it carefully on the table in front of her. She didn't rush. Every second of silence tightened the grip of suspense in the room. Prescott sighed, rubbing his temples. "Miss Bondi, I don't have time for theatrics." "Neither do I, Your Honor," she replied smoothly. "But what I do have is a firm understanding of constitutional law." She let the words settle. Prescott laced his fingers together, as if bracing for whatever was coming next. "You're finding me for wearing a cross," she continued, her voice steady, claiming it violates courtroom neutrality. "But tell me, Your Honor, what legal precedent are you basing that on?" Silence. The court reporter's fingers hovered, the bailiff barely shifted, and even the spectators leaned in just slightly. Everyone was waiting for his response. Prescott let out a slow breath. "This courtroom operates under my authority, Miss Bondi." Pam nodded. "It does. But that authority is not above the Constitution." She tapped the paper in front of her. "And under the First Amendment, personal religious expression is protected, especially when it does not disrupt proceedings." Prescott scoffed. "You're an attorney, not a law professor." Pam smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then let's talk case law." She picked up the paper, flipping to the first highlighted passage. "Tinker versus Des Moines, 1969. The Supreme Court ruled that individuals do not shed their constitutional rights when they enter a government institution, whether that's a school or a courtroom." Prescott's jaw tightened just slightly. He knew that case. Everyone in the legal field did. Pam didn't stop. "West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, 1943. The Supreme Court ruled that compelling individuals to remove or hide symbols of personal belief is a violation of their First Amendment rights." She set the paper down. "Now, Your Honor, would you like me to keep going, or would you prefer to reconsider that fine?" The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Prescott's fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair. He was cornered, and he knew it. For the first time that morning, he hesitated. And in that hesitation, Pam Bondi knew she had just won the first battle. Pam expected some fallout. A few emails, maybe a couple of phone calls from colleagues weighing in. What she hadn't expected was the sheer speed at which everything escalated. By the time she walked into her office the next morning, her assistant Lauren was already waiting with a concerned expression. "You need to see this," she said, holding up her tablet. Pam took it, scanning the screen. The Florida Bar Association had just issued a statement. Carefully worded, neutral in tone, but unmistakable in its implications. Judges have the right to maintain decorum in their courtrooms. While attorneys are afforded personal expression, it is important to respect the rules set forth by presiding judges. We trust our judicial system to navigate these matters with fairness and integrity. Pam let out a slow breath. This wasn't just a comment. This was a warning. The words "respect the rules set forth by presiding judges" weren't just a general statement. They were a signal. The legal world was tight-knit. The Florida Bar rarely commented on courtroom disputes unless they had reason to believe a situation was getting out of hand. This meant one thing. Prescott wasn't just bitter. He was already working behind the scenes, rallying institutional backing. She set the tablet down. "This came out today." Lauren nodded. "An hour ago." Pam wasn't surprised. The legal community was small, word traveled fast, and Prescott clearly wasn't taking this lightly. But before she could say another word, Lauren hesitated. "There's more," she said carefully. Pam glanced up, her expression unreadable. "Go on." Lauren handed her another document, this one printed. Pam skimmed the first few lines, her pulse steady but her mind racing. Attorney Pamela Bondi conducted herself in a manner that disrupted courtroom proceedings, challenged judicial authority inappropriately, and engaged in behavior unbecoming of an officer of the court. Pam couldn't help it. She let out a short, humorless laugh. "Unbecoming." She shook her head. "That's rich." Lauren sighed. "It's retaliation. Pure and simple." Pam leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the armrest. Prescott wasn't just looking for payback. He was trying to set an example. He had lost in his own courtroom, and now he was using the system to reassert his power. By filing this formal complaint, He was trying to flip the narrative. He was no longer the judge who overstepped his authority. He was painting himself as the one who had been disrespected. And Pam, he wanted to make her look like the reckless attorney who had challenged him just for the sake of challenging him. Pam had seen this move before. It was a common tactic. Turn the accuser into the accused, reframe the story, so the real issue got buried beneath bureaucracy and technicalities. But she wasn't about to let that happen. "What's the process on this?" she asked, already shifting gears. Lauren exhaled. "You'll have to respond within 10 days. If the complaint moves forward, they could conduct a formal review." Pam nodded slowly. "And who oversees that review?" Lauren hesitated. "A panel that includes judges and senior attorneys." Pam almost smiled. If Prescott was hoping to bury her in paperwork and quiet pressure, he had miscalculated. Because this wasn't going to be handled quietly. This was about to become very public. Lauren studied her, waiting for her reaction. "What do you want to do?" Pam took a deep breath, then reached for her phone. "If Prescott wants to play games, let's play." She scrolled through her contacts, her mind already 10 steps ahead. Prescott thought she was going to defend herself in a closed-door hearing, accept a quiet reprimand, and move on. But he didn't understand who he was dealing with. Pam had spent her career playing the long game. And now she was about to make sure everyone was watching. She didn't waste time. Retaliation was most effective when it happened in the shadows. Prescott wanted to handle this quietly, using the system against her while keeping the public in the dark. She wasn't about to let that happen. She found the contact she needed and pressed call. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Pam, I was just about to call you." It was Lisa Reynolds, a veteran journalist from a national legal affairs program. She had covered some of Pam's biggest cases before, and more importantly, she wasn't afraid to go after judicial overreach. Pam got straight to the point. "Lisa, I need you to listen carefully. A judge just filed a formal complaint against me for disrupting courtroom proceedings." She paused. "But what really happened?" "He tried to fine me for wearing a cross. And when I stood my ground, he backed down. But now he's using the system to punish me instead." Lisa was silent for a moment. Then she let out a sharp breath. "You're telling me a sitting judge is trying to sanction you because you called out his abuse of power?" Pam smiled. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Lisa didn't hesitate. "I'm running this." Pam leaned forward. "I need it on record before they try to spin it. Once it's public, Prescott won't be able to twist this into a quiet disciplinary issue." Lisa was already on it. "I'll have a segment up by tomorrow, and I'll make sure legal analysts weigh in, especially ones who won't be afraid to call this out for what it is." Pam hung up, feeling the first stirrings of momentum shifting in her favor. But she wasn't done yet. She turned back to Lauren. "Draft a public statement. I want to make my position clear before Prescott and his allies try to muddy the waters." Lauren nodded. "You want to frame this as judicial overreach?" Pam shook her head. "I want to frame it as exactly what it is, an attack on personal rights and an abuse of judicial power. If this judge thinks he can punish me for standing up for myself, imagine what he's done to people who don't have a platform." Lauren's expression hardened. "I'll get it done." Pam exhaled, gathering her thoughts. Prescott had been counting on silence. But now the country was about to find out exactly what he had done. By the time she sat down with her coffee the next morning, her phone was already buzzing nonstop. News outlets had picked up Lisa Reynolds' segment overnight, and social media was ablaze. The headline was everywhere. "Florida judge attempts to punish attorney for wearing a cross. Now he's under fire." It wasn't just conservative outlets running the story. Legal analysts across the board, left, right, and center, were weighing in. A constitutional lawyer from Georgetown went on live television to tear Prescott's logic apart, calling it a blatant overreach that has no legal standing. Another high-profile attorney posted a thread dissecting how Pam's actions had exposed a dangerous precedent that needed to be addressed. And then came the statement Pam had been waiting for. The Florida Judicial Review Board announced that due to the media attention, they would be reviewing Judge Prescott's conduct to determine whether his ruling had violated judicial ethics. Pam leaned back in her chair, exhaling. This was no longer just about her. This was about every attorney, every defendant, every person who had ever stepped into a courtroom wondering whether their rights could be stripped away with a stroke of a judge's pen. Prescott had started this fight, but Pam, she was going to finish it. Pam had expected some fallout. A few emails, maybe a couple of phone calls from colleagues weighing in. What she hadn't expected was the sheer speed at which everything escalated. By the time she walked into her office the next morning, her assistant Lauren was already waiting with a concerned expression, gripping her tablet like it held a live grenade. "You need to see this," Lauren said, her voice hushed but urgent. Pam took the tablet, her eyes scanning the screen. At first glance, it looked like just another dry legal statement, but as she read, the implications hit like a gut punch. The Florida Bar Association had just issued a statement. It was carefully worded, neutral in tone, but unmistakable in its implications. Judges have the right to maintain decorum in their courtrooms. While attorneys are afforded personal expression, it is important to respect the rules set forth by presiding judges. We trust our judicial system to navigate these matters with fairness and integrity. Pam let out a slow breath. This wasn't just a comment. This was a warning. The words, "respect the rules set forth by presiding judges," weren't just a general statement. They were a signal. The legal world was tight-knit, and the Florida Bar rarely commented on courtroom disputes unless they had reason to believe a situation was getting out of hand. This meant only one thing. Prescott wasn't done with her. He was already working behind the scenes to rally institutional backing. She set the tablet down and met Lauren's gaze. "This came out today. An hour ago," Lauren confirmed. Pam wasn't surprised. Word had traveled fast, and Prescott clearly wasn't taking this lightly. But before she could say another word, Lauren hesitated. "There's more," she said carefully. Pam's stomach tightened. "Go on." Lauren handed her another document. This one printed. Pam skimmed the first few lines, her pulse steady, but her mind racing. Attorney Pamela Bondi conducted herself in a manner that disrupted courtroom proceedings, challenged judicial authority inappropriately, and engaged in behavior unbecoming of an officer of the court. Pam couldn't help it. She let out a short, humorless laugh. "Unbecoming." She shook her head. "That's rich." Lauren sighed. "It's retaliation. Pure and simple." Pam leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the armrest. Prescott wasn't just looking for payback. He was trying to set an example. He had lost in his own courtroom, and now he was using the system to reassert his power. By filing this formal complaint, he was attempting to flip the narrative. He was no longer the judge who had overstepped his authority. He was painting himself as the one who had been disrespected. And Pam, he wanted to make her look like the reckless attorney who had challenged him for the sake of challenging him. Pam had seen this move before. It was a common tactic. Turn the accuser into the accused. Reframe the story so the real issue got buried beneath bureaucracy and technicalities. But she wasn't about to let that happen. She turned back to Lauren. "What's the process on this?" Lauren exhaled. "You'll have to respond within 10 days. If the complaint moves forward, they could conduct a formal review." Pam nodded slowly. "And who oversees that review?" Lauren hesitated. "A panel. It includes judges and senior attorneys." Pam almost smiled. So, a room full of Prescott's peers. If he was hoping to bury her in paperwork and quiet pressure, he had miscalculated. Because this wasn't going to be handled quietly. "This is about to become very public," she said, her mind already 10 steps ahead. Lauren studied her, waiting for her reaction. "What do you want to do?" Pam took a deep breath, then reached for her phone. "If Prescott wants to play games, let's play." She scrolled through her contacts, her mind already assembling her next move. Prescott thought she was going to defend herself in a closed-door hearing, accept a quiet reprimand, and move on. But he didn't understand who he was dealing with. Pam had spent her career playing the long game, and now, she was about to make sure everyone was watching. She didn't waste time. She knew how these things worked. Retaliation was most effective when it happened in the shadows. Prescott wanted to handle this quietly, using the system against her while keeping the public in the dark. She wasn't about to let that happen. Her fingers hovered over one particular contact. Then she pressed call. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Pam, I was just about to call you." It was Lisa Reynolds, a veteran journalist from a national legal affairs program. Lisa had covered some of Pam's biggest cases before, and more importantly, she wasn't afraid to go after judicial overreach. Pam got straight to the point. "Lisa, I need you to listen carefully. A judge just filed a formal complaint against me for disrupting courtroom proceedings. But what really happened? He tried to fine me for wearing a cross. And when I stood my ground, he backed down. But now he's using the system to punish me instead. Lisa was silent for a moment, then let out a sharp breath. You're telling me a sitting judge is trying to sanction you because you called out his abuse of power? Pam smiled. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Lisa didn't hesitate. I'm running this. Pam leaned forward. I need it on record before they try to spin it. Once it's public, Prescott won't be able to twist this into a quiet disciplinary issue. Lisa was already on it. I'll have a segment up by tomorrow, and I'll make sure legal analysts weigh in, especially ones who won't be afraid to call this out for what it is. Pam hung up, feeling the first stirrings of momentum shifting in her favor. But she wasn't done yet. She turned back to Lauren. Draft a public statement. I want to make my position clear before Prescott and his allies try to muddy the waters. Lauren nodded. You want to frame this as judicial overreach? Pam shook her head. I want to frame it as exactly what it is. An attack on personal rights and an abuse of judicial power. Her voice hardened. If this judge thinks he can punish me for standing up for myself, imagine what he's done to people who don't have a platform. Lauren's expression mirrored her determination. I'll get it done. Pam exhaled, gathering her thoughts. Prescott had been counting on silence. But now, the entire country was about to find out exactly what he had done. Pam sat in her office, the weight of what had just happened settling over her like a thick fog. The Florida Bar Association's statement was nothing short of a veiled threat. While it pretended to be neutral, she knew exactly what it meant. Prescott had gone beyond sulking. He was actively working to turn the system against her. Lauren stood by her desk, her expression tight. This is a warning shot, she said. They're testing the waters to see how you'll respond. Pam exhaled slowly, running her fingers over the edge of her desk. Then let's give them an answer. A loud one. She grabbed her phone and scrolled through her contacts. The story was already out in the public sphere, but now she needed to push it further, make it impossible for Prescott to twist it in his favor. She found the number she was looking for and pressed call. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Pamela Bondi. I was just about to call you. Lisa Reynolds, a seasoned journalist who had built her reputation on exposing abuses of power. She was exactly the kind of person Pam needed in her corner. Lisa, I need this story to go national. Prescott's pulling strings behind the scenes, and I want his moves out in the open before he has a chance to rewrite the narrative. Lisa chuckled. You don't have to ask me twice. I already have sources telling me he's calling in favors. I was going to run with it tonight, but if you have more, I'm all ears. Pam leaned forward, gripping the edge of her desk. He's using the Florida bar to try and make me look like a rogue attorney. If this sticks, it won't just be me. It'll set a precedent that judges can punish attorneys for standing their ground. Lisa let out a low whistle. That's not just a story. That's a scandal waiting to happen. I'll have my team dig deeper. But Pam, this kind of fight gets ugly. You sure you're ready for it? Pam didn't hesitate. I was born ready. As soon as she ended the call, she turned to Lauren. Draft a statement. I want it clear and direct. No playing nice. I'm calling this what it is. Retaliation. Lauren nodded, already pulling up her laptop. Got it. Pam could feel the tension thickening, the game shifting. Prescott had fired the first real shot, and she was about to fire back. That evening, as Pam drove home, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Her gut told her to ignore it, but instinct wasn't always a luxury she could afford. She answered. Ms. Bondi. The voice was low, steady. Male. You're making powerful enemies. Pam's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Who is this? A pause. A concerned party. A word of advice. Back off before this gets out of hand. She forced a laugh, masking the chill running down her spine. That's funny, because I was about to give you the same advice. Silence. Then a soft chuckle. You're playing a dangerous game. Some battles aren't worth the cost. Pam's jaw clenched. You don't get to decide that. The call disconnected. She stared at her phone, the screen now blank. A threat. Subtle, but unmistakable. She pulled in her driveway, but she didn't step out of the car immediately. Her mind raced. Who was behind the call? Prescott? One of his allies? Or was this bigger than just one judge trying to salvage his pride? She needed to be smarter. She needed to move faster. The next morning, Pam's statement was live, and Lisa Reynolds' segment had aired. Social media was on fire, debates raging in every direction. And then came the moment Pam had been waiting for. The Florida Judicial Review Board released an official notice. They were opening an investigation into Judge Prescott's actions. Lauren rushed into her office, breathless. You did it. It's happening. Pam scanned the notice, her pulse steady, but her mind racing. It's not over yet. If they're investigating, it means they see the potential for wrongdoing. But it also means Prescott will fight back harder. Lauren hesitated. What's the worst he can do? Pam leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment. Judges don't just lose cases like this. If he feels cornered, he'll try to discredit me in ways I haven't even thought of yet. As if on cue, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a news alert. She opened it. Exclusive. Judge Alan Prescott claims attorney Pamela Bondi disrupted court proceedings for political stunt. Pam felt a flicker of something dangerous and dark coil inside her. He's already making his move. Lauren read over her shoulder. They're painting you as a troublemaker. A radical. Pam exhaled sharply. It's a classic move. Shift the blame, muddy the waters, make people question the real issue. Lauren hesitated. So what's our next move? Pam's eyes darkened with determination. We hit back harder. If Prescott wants a war, he just got one. Hours later, Pam stood in front of camera, live on one of the biggest news networks in the country. The interviewer, a sharp-eyed woman named Rachel Sinclair, wasted no time. Ms. Bondi, Judge Prescott claims you were disruptive and staged a political stunt. What do you say to that? Pam didn't blink. I say that's the argument of a man who's run out of legal ones. Rachel raised a brow. So you deny his claims? Pam leaned forward slightly. I didn't disrupt a courtroom. I defended my rights. And now, because he didn't like losing, he's using the system to retaliate. Ask yourself, if he's willing to do this to an attorney with a platform, what does he do to defendants who don't have one? Rachel nodded slowly. You're saying this is bigger than just you. Pam's expression was steel. It always was. By the time the interview aired, Prescott was on the defensive. His carefully constructed narrative was crumbling, and the legal community was split. Some judges were silent, unwilling to take a side. Others quietly distanced themselves. But a few came forward, speaking out against what was happening, calling Prescott's actions inappropriate at best, unethical at worst. Pam sat back in her chair, her phone buzzing nonstop. The tide was shifting, but she knew one thing for certain. Prescott wasn't done yet, and neither was she. Pam didn't have to wait long for the fallout to unfold. The moment the Florida Judicial Review Board announced its investigation, the legal world erupted into a frenzy. News outlets dissected every detail of her confrontation with Judge Prescott, turning it into a national debate. Was he upholding courtroom neutrality, or had he grossly overstepped his authority? Prescott, for his part, remained quiet at first, but silence was not a luxury he could afford. Within 24 hours, reporters cornered him outside the courthouse, cameras flashing, microphones shoved in his direction. His response was clipped, measured, a desperate attempt to control a narrative that was already slipping through his fingers. I have always upheld the integrity of this courtroom. The actions taken were in the interest of maintaining neutrality, he said, his jaw tight. However, I respect the judicial review process and will cooperate fully. Pam almost laughed when she watched the clip. Neutrality? That ship had long since sailed. The world had already seen the truth. He had tried to suppress her, and he had failed. Still, she wasn't naive. She knew Prescott wouldn't go down without a fight. The next morning, Pam arrived at her office to find her assistant, Lauren, pacing near her desk, phone in hand. You need to see this, Lauren said, her voice tense. Pam took the phone and skimmed through the latest article. The headline was damning. Judge Prescott accuses attorney of orchestrating publicity stunt. Pam exhaled slowly. So that was his play. He was trying to flip the script, paint her as an opportunist using the case for fame rather than justice. The article quoted an anonymous legal insider, a classic tactic. Prescott's allies were already working to spin the situation in his favor. Lauren crossed her arms. He's trying to make you look like the problem. Pam set the phone down, her mind already working. Let him try. The facts speak for themselves. If I was just looking for publicity, I would have folded when he rescinded the fine. Instead, I push forward because this isn't just about me. She sat down, pulling out a notepad. We need to get ahead of this. If Prescott wants to attack my credibility, we'll remind the world of his own history. Have Lisa Reynolds pull any past cases where he's displayed questionable judgment. Laura nodded. On it. As soon as she left, Pam picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. Well, if it isn't Pam Bondi. Hello, Senator, she said smoothly. I take it you've heard about my little legal scuffle. A chuckle. Pam, your case is lighting up the national stage. What can I do for you? I need support. Not just from the public, but from the people who matter. Prescott is trying to turn this into a game of reputation. If we let him control the conversation, he'll come out looking like the victim. There was a pause, then a thoughtful hum. I'll make a few calls. Expect some statements of support in the next 24 hours. Much appreciated. She hung up, knowing this was only the beginning. By the next morning, Pam's strategy was already paying off. Statements from well-respected legal figures flooded social media, condemning Prescott's actions. Meanwhile, journalists uncovered old complaints against the judge, small instances of overreach, cases where he had blurred the line between authority and bias. Individually, they weren't enough to take him down, but together, they painted a damning picture. Prescott's foundation was cracking, and he knew it. That's why, 2 days later, Pam received an unexpected email. From Judge Alan Prescott. Subject: Discussion. Pam read the email twice. He wanted to meet. In private. Lauren stood over her shoulder, shaking her head. He's trying to settle this quietly. I know. Pam's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Which means he's worried. She typed out a simple response. Name the time and place. They met in a small, upscale cafe, far from the courthouse. Prescott was already there when she arrived, seated in a booth at the back. He looked more exhausted than before, the weight of public scrutiny evident in his posture. Pam slid into the seat across from him. Judge Prescott. Miss Bondi, he greeted stiffly. I assume you know why I asked you here. I have a few guesses, she said, leaning back. Why don't you tell me? He sighed, rubbing his temples. This has gotten out of hand. The courtroom should be a place of law, not spectacle. Pam arched a brow. You created the spectacle, Your Honor. His jaw clenched. I made a call to maintain order. You made a call based on bias. Silence stretched between them. Finally, he exhaled. What do you want? Pam didn't hesitate. Dropped the formal complaint. Acknowledge that my cross was never a disruption and that your actions were an overreach. He scoffed. You want me to admit I was wrong? You want this to go away? She countered. That's the price. His fingers tapped against the table, his mind weighing his options. And if I refuse? Pam smiled. Then this only gets bigger. A long pause. Then, finally, he nodded. Fine. I'll issue a statement. Pam extended a hand. He hesitated before shaking it. Good choice, Your Honor. The next morning, Judge Prescott released a carefully worded statement. He did not explicitly apologize, but he did acknowledge that his ruling may have been misinterpreted and that he would be withdrawing the complaint against Pam. Pam watched as news anchors picked apart his words, dissecting every sentence. The damage to his reputation was already done. He might have salvaged a bit of dignity, but he had lost the war. Lauren smirked. So what's next? Pam took a deep breath. Now, we make sure this never happens again. She turned to her phone, already drafting the next steps. This wasn't just about Prescott. It was about setting a precedent, one that ensured no judge could ever strip someone of their rights in the name of personal bias. Pam had won, but the real fight, that was just beginning. If you believe in standing up for your rights, make sure your voice is heard. Like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more real stories that matter.